everyone to this discussion on proactive foreign policy of Modi government by Professor Ashwani Mohapatra, Professor in West Asian Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And we also have a very distinguished guest with us, Professor Harsh V. Pant, Department of Defence Studies, King's College, London, who would be chairing this talk. Since we are already late, I would not go into a more detailed introduction of our two distinguished speakers. So I welcome them to Nehru Memorial. I welcome everyone else. And now, without further delay, I hand it over to Professor Pant to conduct the proceedings.
Thank you, Ravi, and welcome to you all. And also, apologies for being late. I think there was, because of some traffic movements, we got a bit delayed, but better late than never. With that, let me, I think, invite Professor Mohapatra to speak on a topic which I think is significant, because there's a lot of debate going on about Mr. Modi's foreign policy. And since May 2014, this debate has been going on. There are two sides to this debate. One, those who argue that there is more style than substantive change in Mr. Modi's foreign policy, in this government's foreign policy. And there are those who are already talking of a fundamental shift in the way India approaches the world. So I think if you look at these two trends, this debate, the contours of an emerging conversation around the so-called Modi policy, the so-called Modi doctrine, or whatever the term you may want to use in this context, it's going to be a very interesting phenomena to uncover in the coming years, both for scholars as well as for practitioners of Indian foreign policy and in diplomacy. It's self-evident, or it's more often than not a truism that nations, the foreign policies of major powers don't really change significantly. But I think what we are witnessing, for a number of reasons, a structural, domestic, political, and also to a certain extent individualistic change in the way Mr. Modi has conducted his foreign policy, that there are certain trends that we can already discern in the last 3 years. And perhaps as this government continues for another 2 years, or possibly after that as well, there will be a more coherent argument around that, more coherent sense, if there is a larger framework around which we can weave an argument about Modi foreign policy, or about a foreign policy of NDA too. So with that, I think I will leave it for Professor Mohapatra to tell us what he thinks are the elements of this foreign policy, and whether or not this proactive foreign policy is significantly different than what we have witnessed in the past, and what are possibly going to be the consequences of that proactive foreign policy.
Thank you, Professor Harsh Pantji. At the very outset, I'd like to apologize for the delay. We are caught up in this bad traffic jam. See, my presentation on proactive foreign policy of the Modi government is structured this way into 3 parts. The first part, particularly those who have keen interest on the international relation as a discipline and foreign policy analysis as a new sub-discipline within the discipline. That is, why do you have to study foreign policy, and how do you examine foreign policy? How to assess the foreign policy behavior of a state, specifically a country like India, which is aspiring for a global role. And second aspect is, in what way I prefer to call it proactive. Yes, there could be some critics who may poo-poo this designation proactive. They say there is nothing but continuity of these old, or the previous government foreign policy. If there is any change, the point of difference is in terms of delivery. Continuation, same program, project, but only Modi is capable of delivering where the previous government was not. And of course, at the same time, in second section, I would like to also highlight some of the changing feature of the international context. So it is the international context or the systemic pressure which determine the foreign policy behavior of a country. It does offer certain opportunities, scope to enhance its status, its power capability, and also at the same time it does impose certain constraint beyond which it cannot expand its influence. And the third part is about the impact of the 3-year-old India government under the dynamic leadership of Prime Minister Modi's, what I call it, transformative impact of Modi foreign policy in terms of generating kind of optimism, confidence, which are missing until May 2014. I call it transformative impact, and this is where I would like to emphasize on as an addition, perhaps, in course of time, to this foreign policy analysis subdiscipline in terms of impact on the society, on the state, on the nation itself. How does the foreign policy of a given country can serve as an instrument in terms of creating confidence among the people, more importantly, reinforcing the oneness, redefining the identity of a nation purely in cultural terms, moving away from this Nehruvian shibboleth or these outdated post-colonial jargons. So these are some of these, I say, the remarkable changes, a remarkable impact of the foreign policy initiative and practices of the Modi government in the last 3 years, likely to be felt on the nation as a whole. To begin with, when you look at foreign policy of a given country, so there is a debate. Some would say the foreign policy of a country is largely, how much time am I giving? 30 minutes. Oh, sorry. 30 minutes. So normally the realistic perspective, so where the foreign policy analysis of discipline is concerned, the state foreign policy behavior is largely determined by the systemic structure. And so nothing to do with the internal or the domestic political, social, economic dynamics. That is the job of the Indian politicals who emphasize on what they say that an analyst needs to open the black box to find the peculiar attributes of a state, of a unit, to understand the foreign policy behavior of the state. So what is important for us is the internal system and the units of states, the way they are located, the great powers, middle powers, and small powers, in terms of the power distribution across the system, and second, how the structure changes and how the state compete in an environment of anarchy, and they always compete to secure what they call the territorial survival, or the survival of the state, of the territorial security, or the physical security of the state. I'd like to add here, apart from the physical security of the state, there's something called ontological security. The ontological security has much to do with the self-identity of a state. So the main purpose of a foreign policy is not only to ensure the physical security, the physicality of the state, the territorial sovereignty of the state, in addition to that, its own identity, that's how a state internally remains peace at itself. It doesn't feel threatened so far as its own self-defined identity is concerned. And the third part is, all the states compete to maximize power. So here, interestingly, here power is the means in terms of the possession of capability of each state, and power also at the same time is the end. So what is the end? The capabilities are the means to maximize influence of a given state. The states compete, number one, for survival, and number two, to maximize influence. And that applies, lastly, to those states located in this hierarchy at the middle. The country like India, obviously, you'll find that India has been trying to project itself as emergent power. Then, third aspect, the theoretical aspect is what is difficult to assess or what I call the measure power unless the power is actually exercised. So power is essentially performance trait. You can't assess power before. Power has to be felt. Power has to be seen in terms of effecting change of others' attitude, beliefs, and approach. So power is assessed only when it is exercised. So that's number 2 is how a state possesses capability, the military strength, the economic might, the cultural significance, what I call the cultural capital, but how to convert this capacity into capability. That's a challenge for a given state. And once you have the capability, then it depends whether the state is willing to use the capabilities or deploy the capability in pursuit of power maximization or influence maximization. So very broadly, given the time constraints, I normally think of a 3-dimensional aspect of power, the 3P. One is possession, and second is the projection, and third is perception. You possess the capabilities, the ability to act, but then second is you have the willingness to project it, and third, perception. That depends the perception of other states about the power holder. Yes, X has the power capability and it is prepared to use it to deter any kind of threat, to expand its influence or counter any potential threat. That's the way one has to judge the concept of power. Why I mention this? I mention this in the context of the discourse which lastly dominated the American and the Western academia and the policy makers until recently, and which started sometime around 2008. Professor Pant wrote a book on China. I had a chance to read it, 100-odd pages. And the Americans, for the first time, 2008 onwards, began to realize what they earlier foolishly believed in, credulously believed in this peaceful rise of China. So from the peaceful rise of China, they realized the rise of a power not necessarily be peaceful. You can't say that China only in economic power, and it is not likely to translate its economic strengths into strategic assets and political influence. So there is a time, as a kind of counterpoint to China, the Americans started portraying India as another emergent power rivaling the status of China. So from 2008 onwards till recently, and still goes on, for a variety of reasons. So you have the two emergent powers, India and China, largely based on India's economic performance between 8 to 9% GDP growth from 2005 onwards, and its technologies, particularly in the IT sector, which made people aware that the country which is emerging as a powerful and which could be a potential counterbalance to China's influence is India. But then it comes second part. What happened? See, the whole power projection of India in a way took off in the last India government under the dynamic leadership and the charismatic leader that fortunately had Sri Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And it is all reduced to nothing but hype because of the political opponents in the country. Oh, because slogan, if you recall, the incredible India. But that is not hype. It was in reality, in the sense it did stir aspiration, kind of confidence, kind of oval optimism among the younger generations, those inside the country and living outside the country. Yes, India can do it. But since 2005, signing of this civil nuclear deal by the UPA government, concluded by 2008, so afterwards you'll find there was declining interest on the part of the UPA government to act on the basis of whatever the capability that you had to project India as an emergent power. So much so that they not only side away, they even become what I call averse to act. There is a in IR jargon called the risk averse. UPA government was even act averse. It had aversion to act. So the problem lies with last government in converting the capability or the capacity into capability and deploying them in an attempt to project India as a power or a potential power, an emergent power. So this was largely because, as the analysts say, the way the incredible India the campaign backfired in 2004 electoral debacle suffered by the BJP. So they didn't want to touch it at all. It could be because of its alliance partner, the Communist of India, who perhaps never wanted, because they continued to subscribe the so-called moralistic principle and idealism, which perhaps they're reluctant to preach to their Chinese counterparts in Beijing, but they do preach in India. Nothing to do with the what I call outreach activities, India's expansion, projection power. Let's concentrate on economic development within and wait another 10 years, 15 years. When the time comes, then India will begin to assert itself. Theoretically speaking, never happens. Everything, whatever, any phenomenon that arises in a given period of time, so it has a context which conditions it. Second most important thing, as a student of historical sociology, you need to remember that time and space matters a lot. As a result, very briefly, the 10 years of UPA rule is nothing but turned out to be a lost decade. 2011, Professor Pant wrote a book highlighting the Chinese growing assertiveness in South China, from East China Sea to South China Sea. The way China was trying to challenge Japan in East China and South China, the way it tried to coerce the smaller powers in accepting its dictate. But same thing, that's don't, in a way I think he advised the Indian policy-making elite at that period of time to understand the power dynamics. And perhaps he wanted to send a message across that the international context is nothing but characterized by theoretically what is called the power transition. And the power transition historically has been quite chaotic. It has never been historical. It has never been peaceful. Sorry. So whenever you have a rising power, the power which tries to rise or to acquire a new status, obviously it confronts the resistance from the established power. The established power always tries to maintain the status quo, maintain the existing order, because it believes the existing international order is largely predicated on its own values and institution norms. So it doesn't, in a way, it doesn't like any other country rising to the action to oppose, to resist its status. So that situation, kind of confrontation is often inevitable. Either the confrontation could be by this rising power itself or the established power when it tries to get the allies around to stop, to prevent the second power rising or emerging to challenge the status quo. And that was something theoretically discussed by Organsky way back in 1968, the book on world politics. He predicted the rise of China as a power to challenge the hegemonic status, or what was largely called the hegemonic stability of the international system, largely because of the political economic primacy of the United States of America. So, entire system was undergoing change. Unfortunately, there was no such calibrated, framed, a timely response coming from the UPA too. How to counter it, how to strategize so as to contain the threat or the danger, if at all, it becomes a reality. So instead, the UPA government was domestically focused And apart from that, you had the series of scams and scandals that it was all through caught up in dealing with this, with the steady erosion of its credibility and popularity. And the result is, India was described by the analyst in America and the West as a status inconsistent power. Status inconsistent power, basically it refers to the perception of the power holder, the discrepancy between what a state possesses and what it aspires for. So in that situation, look at the impact. The impact was that India should remain inward looking, sort of go beyond the territorial boundaries. And India was more focused on the domestic political issues, again in this name of this, the most popular terminology like secularism, liberalism, democracy, and show must show that. The smaller neighbors like Maldives didn't hesitate to give a slap on the face of, diplomatic slap on the face of the Indians by asking the Indian airport operator to wind up from Malé. The things are changing in Nepal, the traditionally, culturally close friend of India. Same was in Bangladesh. And you had these, the Chinese intervention, particularly economic, expansion of economic might in countries like Sri Lanka. So India hardly could do anything to counter this growing Chinese influence in its neighborhood. So at one level, psychological level, you have the pervasive cynicism, complete skepticism. Oh, we can't do it. We shouldn't aspire for it. We made a mistake. By aspiring for that kind of global status, we shouldn't. So you had a second thought. And second important is its smaller neighbors beginning to counter India, because the India, the Bharat, you see, the region should not be called as South Asia. It's the Indian subcontinent. In terms, in geographic terms, population terms, in terms of overall contribution to the regional economy, in terms of trade, more than 70%. It is nothing but India. It is Bharat continent. But unfortunately, during the Cold War, the area was designated as South Asia, and our neighbors preferred to be called and known as South Asian than something else. So whatever it is, we are losing, our strategic space was shrinking steadily in the region because of, as I mentioned, the aversion to act. Number two, lack of any vision, unimaginative, non-innovation. But doesn't mean the Prime Minister Modi never visited abroad 72 times. 10th of his entire 10-year period as Prime Minister spent abroad. That's a situation. And in that backdrop, you have to see the rise of NDA under the charismatic Prime Minister Modi. And people, critics say, just 3 pages out of 52 pages of the BJP manifesto directly dealt with the foreign policy. So the criticism was against NDA government and the Prime Minister Modi was quite natural. When they thought Modi is not likely to give much attention to Indian foreign policy. He began, if you look at his every step, I think this is all causally connected towards the larger vision project, what I call projection of India as Jagat Guru, as a powerful nation recognized by the international community. That's a vision. But the moment we expect things to happen, in just 3 years at a time, 3 years is spent, I tell you, by the present government cleansing the establishment. Too much of, that's what I call it, kudakachara, like accumulated over the years, difficult to streamline the administration. So, the criticism during UPA government was that not only India has a limited, smaller strategic community, they even unstrategized things. These are standard criticism by none other than the great lover of India, Stephen Coy. So if you read this criticism, in the light of the criticism, what Prime Minister Modi did, the people just failed to understand why he first paid a visit to a smaller neighbor, Bhutan. What is it for? followed by other South Asian regions. Two objective, perhaps he had in mind. Sometimes I felt comprehend what Modi has in his mind. I think a soothsayer even cannot predict. So look at his vision. The purpose of his visit to South Asian small country was to reclaim the strategic space, the space there which we're losing first to China. Second, perhaps he had in mind, in course of time, once you integrate the smaller neighbors into a India-led economic system or framework, then the interdependence, the economic interdependence between India and the smaller neighbors would act as a kind of hedge against their leanings toward China. And third, perhaps he had in mind, was to free himself through a pursuit of zero problem in neighbor, so that India would be free to pursue the ambitious goal beyond its territory. That was the reason why he first paid his attention, or focused his attention on the neighborhood first policy. Then, second, he moved on to transform the look east into act east, to various initiatives. His involvement in Southeast Asia, again, only through economic cooperation. Then, for the first time, he had the meeting of these smaller Pacific islands, I think 14 of them. So that's what idea was, to create a kind of curb out a sphere of influence, or at least space for India in the Asia-Pacific region, independent of the United States of America. So those who criticize that aligning with America, India risk losing the strategic space or strategic autonomy is not true, precisely because India has to secure support of America in the current phase to counter the growing influence of China. One. Number two, the voices being raised in the region in support of India. And number three, the optimism some of these countries like Vietnam, Philippines, even to next Japan have towards India. How do you form an alliance, at least, to counter the Chinese influence, at least to contain its influence in the days ahead? So then the criticism was leveled, it is basically Hindu party, so it will not pay much attention to West Asia. I've just mentioned, it's Prime Minister Modi's visit to UAE after how many years? More than 2 decades. Imagine $40 billion remittances coming from the Gulf countries, with 7 million workers. At least the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh must have visited the United States of America more than 10 times, but not in once he bothered to visit UAE. And here the Prime Minister Modi goes to UAE, strikes up the kind of personal chemistry with the ruler, and managed to get a kind of concession, something unthought of before, the construction of Hindu temple in UAE, in Dubai. So what you find here is the strategizing in this foreign policy which never took place before. Then his visit to Saudi Arabia. Then, despite the traditional rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, he managed to get concession from both the sides, managed to get both on board in alienating Pakistan, the traditional patron or the supporter of Pakistan, both ideologically and materially. Managed to get Iran on board to counter the Chinese influence in Pakistan and in Central Asia. The deal which is pending for long over the port, the Chahawar port, it was done in hardly a month's time. All of the outstanding issues, particularly the payment issue to the Iranian side, was settled by this direct intervention of Prime Minister Modi. So relations began to warm up with Iran. And finally, the latest visit of Prime Minister Modi to Israel. That's huge. Breaking away from this convention and the what I call the prejudices or the conventional logic. Look, you have to have either of the two camps. You can't go to the Muslim country at the same time. You can't build a friendship with Israel. But he has proved it. We need Israel as much as we need the Muslim countries around with us in the common fight against the radical Islamist terrorism. And the last thing that I would like to say here is we live in a world which is today's world, which is in a state of flux. Any variable that you pick up to explain or to predict the behavior of a state would turn out to be quite misleading. The variable itself is in flux. So the world is in a state of flux. Flux means uncertainty, unpredictability. Nobody ever thought that Britain would one day say goodbye to European Union, most likely followed by Italy. Nobody ever thought that the new American president would think in terms of withdrawing from Asia-Pacific regions, the Asia-Pacific partnership. So what's going to happen is difficult to predict. And keeping in mind, I would say those who say or criticize the government because they are looking forward to visible directional change in foreign policy of India. So let me very briefly tell you theoretically what kind of changes one expect. Directional changes, change in foreign policy of state, orientation change in foreign policy of a state, or a fundamental overhauling change in foreign policy of a state. So three kinds. Direction, it's like in terms of you are leaning towards west or the north, suddenly you lean towards south or west vis-a-vis east. That's a change. Orientation, basically how you orient yourself, your attitude, beliefs. And third, overhauling change, fundamental change, it involves everything. Lastly, it's a huge change from dependence to independence or self-dependence. From alliance to autonomy or neutral foreign policy. See, given situations, extremely difficult to pinpoint what kind of change it is. It is definitely not a directional change. It is a change in terms of the overall goal of the government. What is the goal? The goal is projection of India, Bharat, as a powerful global actor. An actor which has a capability to frame rule, not simply a rule taker, also a rule maker. Again, a point. Number two, a global power, not as somebody say, is a benign hegemon or a coercive hegemon, nothing of that sort. It's a global power to disseminate the traditional ancient knowledge of this land and to project itself as the Jagat Guru. What is this? What it is supposed to project? It's supposed to project tolerance. It's not tolerating diversity, respecting diversity. This is what is embedded in our culture, the Vedic culture, Sanatani culture, and that is to project it, which I call the soft power. And the international community acceptance of yoga is indicative of the appreciation of the India's culture. And that's what I say, the soft power itself would supplement to India's hard power capability in turning it into like an influential, I'm not using deliberately terminology like hegemon or something like that. I'm saying an influential global actor in the days ahead. Then what is needed for that? If you look at the power capability, three components: military, economic, culture. I mentioned that. And all these sectors which make an entity of state powerful are interconnected. So if you study foreign policy of Modi government, you'll find how this interconnectedness is inherent in its foreign policy. The Make in India is not simply, making India as a manufacturing hub. Make in India also applicable to defense sector. I hope some of you are well aware of the fact that India, particularly Tata company, signed the F-16 with Lockheed. We are going to manufacture F-16. Imagine, think of its symbolic importance. F-16 with Make in India going from India. What impact it has. If you go abroad, the moment you come out of the step out of the airport, you see everywhere Tata Construction Company. It gives a kind of confidence. Oh, my country is known here. So I'll come to the interpretation of meaning and messages and symbols and what Modi foreign policy has conveyed to the world. So these are interrelated, whether it's a Make in India or the modernization military, in order to enhance a defense preparedness capability to counter any kind of eventuality. It is free from any kind of the controversial scam, liquors, all kinds of things that used to take place before. Compromising with the standard quality of the military hardware that used to buy or purchase, import from outside. So these are interrelated. Make in India, we sign a deal with a foreign country and pressurize the country to start manufacturing in India the way what the Chinese did it 25 years back. Okay. So that's the significance of Make in India. He didn't just plot the idea of Make in India just like that. He had some concrete ideas or comprehension of the implication in his mind. So Make in India is not simply a kind of jargon or in a kind of campaign. It has certain meaning. It has certain value. So finally, when I discuss about the transformative impact of Modi government foreign policy, I would like to highlight here, to begin with, I've just gone through some of these articles written by the columnists and the critics in the India's leading newspaper. Oh, no, there is hardly any change. The change is not visible. Somebody has gone to a ridiculous extent of comparing Modi's out-of-box foreign policy initiative to a kind of madman theory, comparing with President Nixon. Oh, and another critic of India, who is based in Paris, fellow guys by ours, JNU-based social scientist very much, often quote him. I don't want to mention his name. He says, what is Modi is doing? A tamasha, drama. All the underlying tamasha, there is a meaning. You need to understand that. If you appreciate the peculiar condition existed, prevailed in the country before, then the meaning is very clear, which direction he is moving. So ultimately, reluctantly, they considered this. Okay, there is some change in terms of delivery. What is the delivery? All the mega projects were all initiated by the UPA government. But it's true. Many of them are initiated by, including the yesterday newspaper called it the mother of all the underwater deals, the naval deals, which are languishing for the last 10 years. 7 years down the line, some of the submarines would be aged, would be outdated. What happened? So when the critics said delivery, yes, Modi delivers, but then delivery is important because it has to be timely. The 10 years we lost, China left us behind 20 years. And you plotted all mega ideas, ambitious project, but you had no time to implement them, my dear. So delivery is not simply delivering. It's delivering on time. And delivering something in Indian context extremely problematic, challenging to any policymakers. You need to think about the ways how to circumvent the problems which arise on the ground to implement particular project. It's not that easy. I mentioned about the Chahwar port with Iran, lying for several years. Then everything, you look at the defense sector, more than 2 lakh crores under the former defense minister Parikar was spent on signing deal and even with a time limit for the delivery of the weapons. Why? This defense preparedness would enhance your military capability or military infrastructure if India under Modi is aiming at projecting India as a power to reckon with. It is, after all, the hard power which would ensure prestige. Now, prestige is terminology used in IR theory as well. The power gets you a prestige, recognition, and soft power is simply supplement to that. It is never substitute to that. So those who have been preaching ideals, morals, need to understand that without the hard power, it's difficult to confer the legal recognition of India as a global player. And that is what very important message that I find Shepherd Modi foreign policy concern. And finally, 2 minutes more, and finally, when you look at just 3 years now, I'm quite hopeful, like many of my young friends. India is a youthful nation, and Modi's ambition is well shared by the millions of youth as reflected in social media. And we look forward to, hopefully, another term, and definitely you'll find the new initiative of Prime Minister Modi, of course, given this, as I say, that the state of flux that the international situation scenario is. But so far, how do I assess it? I call it transformative impact on the society and nation. What is it? If we look at the situation prevailing until May 2014, I said cynicism, skepticism, loss of confidence. Okay. And this helped which kind of forces? Divisive forces. Image of India outside was a society fragmented, a polity torn asunder. There is no consensus, imagine. Hence, India cannot become a power at all. That was 2013 December. Okay. And this image, external image, internally, because India was not in a position to do anything, it did give the encouragement to the forces quite active, including my own university. The manifestation in 2015 was not simply sheer coincidence or accident. It happened, it had to happen. It was a response of frustrated elements to the unifying project. I'm saying unifying. I'm not saying uniformity. Unifying project of Prime Minister Modi, based on the fundamental premise that is called the cultural sharedness, cultural unity of this land, ancient land Bharat. It is not a unity in diversity, it's a diversity in unity. It is not simply a whole made up of fragments, component, the way Partha Chatterjee describes my country. No, each fragment has a meaning because it is connected to the whole. Whole has a meaning because it's connected to the fragments. So I am talking purely in constructivist perspective. The meaning here is derived because the whole and the fragments, the parts are mutually constituted. That is the cultural entity called Bharat. And this idea, when it begin to dominate the academic intellectual discourse, contesting the hegemonic discourse lastly defined in terms of the so-called liberal Marxist Western-inspired, Western-oriented ideas, there has to be resistance. At the discursive level, there is resistance to the idea of redefining India, which was reflected in Modi's foreign policy when he raised this, when he was campaigning during the election, India first. Not any community and sect. And the divisive elements who always were busy in politicizing the apolitical cleavages in the country only for sheer votes and electoral gains. So, in a nutshell, what I try to say, here is a foreign policy which is a function of unifying India, changing the academic intellectual discourse from fragmentary India to unifying India. That is what I call the transformative impact of Modi's foreign policy last 10 years. Thank you very much.